Good evening to everyone joining us from Japan, and good afternoon for those of you joining us from Stockholm and elsewhere in Europe. Welcome to the fourth event of the Europe-Asia webinar series, hosted jointly by the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies and the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, Sweden. My name is Sam Barron. I'm a research fellow here at Whitecaps. I'll be co-moderating today's discussion alongside my colleague, Dr. Jagannath Panda, the head of the Stockholm Centre for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at ISDP. For today's webinar, we'll be hosting a roundtable of experts to discuss the future of India's economic ties with China and what direction they may be heading as their bilateral relationship increasingly inches towards antagonism. Armed clashes in the border regions between India and China have become the highlight of this antagonism in recent years, and both sides have been steadily investing in border infrastructure development as their respective forces enter into clashes with greater frequency. As a strong response to China's aggressive posturing across the border, India has taken a number of measures to punish Beijing, including by banning Chinese apps and imposing restrictions on key products such as mobile phones, dairy and milk products, steel products, and electronic items. To top it off, 2023 marks India's hosting of the G20 and its presidency of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings, two major multilateral summits of which China is a key part. To help us understand some of the dynamics at play in the India-China relationship at present, joining us this evening are Dr.Sriparna Pathak, Dr. B.R. Deepak, and Mr. Otto Brar. Dr.Sriparna Pathak is an associate professor and the associate dean of admissions at the Jindal School of International Affairs of the OP Jindal Global University in Haryana, India. She teaches courses on foreign policy as well as theories of international relations, and her previous work experiences include research stints at Gauhati University, Bosco University, India's Ministry of External Affairs, where she served as a consultant for the Policy Planning and Research Division, the Observer Research Foundation, and the South Asia Democratic Forum in Brussels, where she's also a research fellow. Dr. B.R. Deepak is a professor and the chair of the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He was trained in Chinese studies at Peking University, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and the University of Edinburgh. And his recent publications include India's China's Dilemma, The Lost Equilibrium and Widening Asymmetries, and India and China Beyond the Binary Friendship of Enmity. Mr. Otto Brar is currently a Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs Fellow and a visiting scholar at the National Chengchi University in Taipei. He writes 2 columns for The Print, which feature topics including China's domestic politics, China's international relations, and international security in East Asia. He was previously a China media journalist at the BBC World Service and holds a master's in international politics from SOAS in London. A quick reminder before I hand over the floor to Dr. Panda is that this event is on the record and is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Whitecaps YouTube channel. So please keep this in mind and please feel free to type any questions you may have for the speakers in the chat below. So with that, over to you, Jagannath.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that kind introduction, and lovely to be here. Let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Jagannath Panda. I'm heading the South Asia and Indo-Pacific Center at the ISDP. Currently, I'm visiting Tokyo. I'm here for a couple of weeks, and I could see a lot of Japanese colleagues attending this discussion. And I'll be happy if there is any occasion to meet them or interact with them. Please feel free to drop me an email. Fantastic to have this panel with us from India. And I could see the 3 names you have introduced, Sam. They are known to me. Both, all of them, Sriparna, Adil, and Professor Deepak. They have been good China hand in India and elsewhere. They have been writing about India-China related issues for a long time. So I'm sure this discussion is going to be very fruitful and useful at a time when there is a lot happening between China and India. Now, just to start with, as the international audience could see it, that India, Delhi is hosting the G20 Summit, and this is a very crucial moment for Delhi at a time not only to portray itself as a power to the outside world, but also to try to think about how to really, maneuver in its relationship with China, particularly at a time when the Chinese President Xi Jinping has decided not to come for the G20 summit. In fact, he has deputed the Chinese premier to come and attend the G20 summit. And I think that's a big decision by the Chinese president. Of course, the Russian president not attending the G20 summit, in many quarters, it was anticipated primarily due to the fact that if we see Russia's recent behavior and recent foreign policy approach, President Putin has decided not to attend many crucial global events, particularly given its decision to go for the war with Ukraine for the last 1.5 years. But Chinese president not attending the G20 summit, it is a crucial decision, not only in Chinese foreign policy, because what we have seen in Chinese foreign policy over the last 2 to 3 decades is that China has always taken as a leadership position in many global events. So not attending the G20 summit is a very significant decision on the part of Xi Jinping. So to that effect, I'll start with these brief comments, inviting each of our panelists to comment on this decision by Xi Jinping. How do you really see Xi Jinping's decision not to come to India to attend the G20 summit? And how do you really portray it in the context of China-India relations, particularly at a time when there is a trade growth is happening despite of the slowdown in the China-India relationship? How do you really read this decision by Xi Jinping? And how do you really anticipate the China-India relations evolving from here on, particularly at a time also when in the G20 summit, there was supposed to be a lot of discussion about global economic recovery, the supply chain, and also including about many infrastructure and sustainable developmental oriented projects. So I would invite your comments first, Sriparna, and then followed by Professor Deepak and then Adil, maybe 3 to 4 minutes initially, and then we'll go eventually to other most pressing part of the discussion, that is the China-India economic issues. Over to you, Sriparna.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Sam. Just to be very quick, there are a lot of theories floating around regarding why Xi Jinping not attending the G20 summit. There's one of the very plausible reasons is scolded by Xi at the Petai conference this year because of his complete lack on economic issues. That's one reason which is floating around. Then the other issue is that, there's going to be at the G20, there's going to be a discussion on debt restructuring. And the world knows about China's debt traps. That's an external, foreign policy decision. But even there are huge, enormous debt problems domestically within China. There's a huge possibility this might come up. And then there's another reason that US President Biden is definitely attending, and US-China relations have not been great for the last many years, and it's been only deteriorating. So this, could be an attempt to just avoid meeting Joe Biden. And the most significant reason, as far as I see it, is that because of G20 and India's presidency of the G20, India has been able to raise a lot of issues of the global south, pertaining to food security, pertaining to oil prices, amidst a very difficult, volatile situation because of the Russia-Ukraine war. As has been China's attempts even in the past, starting from Mao Zedong in the 1950s, any sort of leadership attempt by any other country of the global south is not taken very easily or not taken lightly by China. Mao Zedong had also said these things when India became, one of the biggest champions of the non-aligned movement. India is tied to the apron strings of its colonial masters. India is sitting on the fence. These were those sorts of narratives. Cut to 2023, again, when India is raising concerns of the global south, that's not being taken very well by China. So being in the same room wherein, India steals the limelight, while there's a huge criticism of Xi Jinping, which is happening, that's not really acceptable to Xi Jinping, which is why, this reason seems the most acceptable or the most possible one to me as to why he's not attending the G20 summit.
Thank you very much. Professor Deepak?
Yeah, thank you, Jagannath. Thank you, Sam, and all our audiences all over the world. It's a pleasure to share some of my views, mostly on Sriparna's alliance, but I still have a few things to add. The one, of course, is the state of the Chinese economy, which has shown deflationary trends, owing to the diminishing returns on investment, shrinking consumption, and export figures. And these were the three pillars of China's growth trajectory in all these years, or Xi Jinping may prefer it to call it the reform era, because he identifies his era as a new era. And second, I think we know there's a purge of the top commanders of the PLA rocket force going on, and mysterious death of one of the deputy commanders of the PLA rocket force. So this high degree of trust deficit between the top leadership of the party and the PLA top echelon perhaps is another reason that he is a little insecure, and he wished to have the things under his control. And it is speculated that Wei Fenghe, former commander of the rocket forces and defense minister, is also on the radar. I think his absence also indicates that China prefers small groupings like BRICS, like SCO, where it allows China to have a greater, maybe say, and as China has defined, quote unquote, true multilateralism, perhaps Xi Jinping doesn't see true multilateralism in organizations or multilateral institutions like G20. Finally, as Sriparna has pointed out, it is also, because of the widening chasm with the US and its allies. This, of course, will make Xi Jinping uncomfortable and perhaps isolated during the summit, as the four lines have been drawn. Putin is out and Xi is out, so it polarizes the world community. And finally, I think people have brushed aside India-China relations. I think this is also one of the very important component why Xi Jinping, would not like to attend and then be there just, as a leader in the lines like any other leader. But the show has been, stolen by Prime Minister Modi. And more importantly, recently, I would like, to draw audience's attention to one of the writings by Lan Jianshui. So he is director of Asia Pacific Institute of the China Institute of International Studies, which is of course funded by MOFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has, written one article on India-China relation, which where he says that, in order to highlight India as a leading force, this Ling Daxing Liliang, in reshaping the international order, perhaps, he believes that Modi government is, holding the banner of rule-based, transparent, and reform-oriented multilateralism rather than the true multilateralism of China. Perhaps another reason is that he has also said that China sees India pushing China out from the global south. So this is another concern. So maybe we talk more, on these later if time permits. Over to you, Jagannath.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Adil, quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Panda and Sam, for the invitation. I will echo some of the comments made by my colleagues, but I will draw a distinction about, China having certain economic issues at home. I think Xi Jinping is at a point where he can delegate power, so I don't see that as a driving factor behind the reason he's not in New Delhi today. It has more to do with the international context where China finds itself, and China wants to promote a kind of multilateralism where China is at the top and other countries follow after that. So this hierarchy that China has in mind, especially in the global south, is something that Beijing has been talking about for a long time. And now they're actioning these ideas by skipping a summit, by sending a message that Xi has other important issues to take care of. China also has a Belt and Road Initiative event coming up in October where President Putin will be present. So they're giving emphasis to other events like that, as well as BRICS, to create an impression that China has arrived on the global scene and they have other important events to go to rather than by the US. And The second signal that I see is directly towards India and relations with New Delhi in context of the border standoff, which remains unaddressed. And what we saw at BRICS was the tension between Prime Minister Modi and Xi while they were trying to have a bilateral meeting that really never happened. So that gives you another signal that China is not comfortable with the new active role that India has taken on global affairs. It's a great opportunity for New Delhi, but China is not happy giving that role to New Delhi so easily. It wants to maintain a hierarchy. Xi Jinping took out some time to meet the president of the Red Cross recently, which is to me an interesting event. You know, president of China is meeting somebody not so significant and taking out time for that rather than being in New Delhi. That tells you something that Xi is sending a message across by sending Li Qiang to the ASEAN summit as well as New Delhi, a premier was one of the weakest premiers so far in history of PRC. And these actions, if you put them together, tell you something about why Xi doesn't want to be in New Delhi today, doesn't want to meet the president of US, as well as Prime Minister from Japan and the Prime Minister of India. So avoiding it would be something that China finds in its interest today.
Thank you, Adil, for those comments. In fact, we lost you for a very brief moment, couple of times, but you were loud and clear otherwise. But very good, very fantastic points made by all the three presenters. In fact, one issue which is coming in all of your remarks is that there is US, there is India, and also Indo-Pacific allies. Those have encouraged Xi to take this decision. Now, the thing is that I think I would agree with all of you to the extent that probably in the BRICS summit, what we saw is that there was no bilateral summit between Xi and Modi. But also, I mean, we also as a scholar, sometimes those who believe and work in the policy world should also read some of these issues, is that the handshake between Xi Jinping and Modi was also very tenseful. It was not really, very cordial. There was chemistry meeting. There was confidence missing between towards each other. So those are elements which explains that probably Xi Jinping was finding himself in a very tight corner. He was finding very aloof in the BRICS summit to an extent when it was coming to Prime Minister Modi. So there was no chemistry between them anymore. And probably as the host of the G20 Summit, India and Modi, and as China could already see that India is, focusing a lot in terms of campaigning itself as the bearer of Global South. So probably this is a kind of opportunity he decided not to really take into China's advantage. But this would encourage me to ask each one of you in the context of today's discussion, particularly bringing the economic dimension into the forefront of our discussion, that how much do you see that Xi Jinping or China not attending this year's G20 summit, even though, we know the Chinese premier is attending, and G20 summit is more about global economic issues, governance issues. But knowing the fact that in recent past, Chinese politics has been really quite one-man oriented, that is Xi Jinping oriented, how much you think it is an economic miss for China in the context of G20 and from here on? Do you really see that China missed a global opportunity, a grand opportunity to actually be a part of that discussion where we are, as Sriparna rightly pointed out, that we were about to probably discuss about debt restructuring, sustainable developmental issues in the G20 summit? How much it is a missed opportunity for China, and how much it is a capital moment for India to take advantage of the process? And do you think that this would only intensify the China-India economic ties in the multilateral forums from now on? How do you really see? So there are 3 points I would like to raise your attention on. One is that how much you think it is a missed opportunity for China. Second, how much it is a capital moment for India in terms of taking forward the supply chain networking or restructuring debates in the Indo-Pacific regions, and also to talk about some of the economic issues, pressing economic issues, debt restructuring to, a kind of sustainable development and the clean infrastructure, the quality infrastructural issues in the G20 summit. Third, how much it is going to complicate China-India multilateral forums from now on. So I'll go in the reverse order maybe this time. So over to you, Adil, first, and then Professor Deepak, and then Sriparna. Over to you, Adil, first.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. Let me start by saying that on the economic front, India has been taking an expansive set of actions against Chinese companies. So India has not really put out a China strategy that other countries have. So we'll have to assess what India really wants in terms of China strategy from the actions that India has taken. So India in 2020 amended the FDI investment law to make sure that countries that have a land border with India don't really get to invest in India. And that action was primarily targeted at China. Similarly, an action was taken against BYD, which is the EV company in China. And the company was looking to invest about $1 billion. And the company was stopped from investing that amount, as well as similar actions against Chinese phone company Xiaomi. Is something, again, a major decision that New Delhi has decided to stop Xiaomi from functioning in the way they have in the past. And that tells you there are significant concerns in New Delhi over China getting control on the Indian economy, on the Indian political economy. So now India has decided to take a set of actions which send a signal to China that your activities over the years, which have allowed you to gain market access inside India, is not acceptable, because we have not been able to get that kind of access in China. So this dual system that China has of maintaining control of the economy by having a 51% control of the companies is something that stops companies from India and elsewhere from growing within China. So that has been the case. But now what has happened, something new, is this whole economic security component that is driving the thinking in New Delhi is going to have a major impact on India-China economic ties. And that has already started having some impact. So in the first quarter of 2023, there was some decline in the trade between India and China. That was for the first time since the last 2 years. So the last 2 years, we've seen that the trade has passed $100 billion. Though some data published just yesterday says that trade is well on its way of crossing $100 billion mark. But that kind of slight decline tells you that New Delhi's actions are having some impact on this bilateral trade. So New Delhi does want to reduce dependence on Chinese companies, reduce overall dependence on key things that would be difficult to come by if there is conflict in the region vis-a-vis Taiwan or other scenarios. So in that context, New Delhi is looking to reduce dependence anyhow possible. That would not integrated nowadays in completely cutting out India-China trade would be not possible, and it's detrimental to India's growth.
Sorry to stop you. We lost you for a moment. So can you please repeat your last couple of points?
Sure. So it would be detrimental for India's growth over the long run if India-China trade stops entirely. Indian companies, Indian organizations need China for basic goods and essentials. So this relationship is not going to come to a halt, as some commentators have suggested. It will likely continue in this difficult manner where both countries will have to find their space, and which creates opportunities for conflict, I would say. Because there is this interaction at the BRICS, at the SCO, and if these multilateral organizations stop functioning, the chances of conflict escalates from there. That's what I see today, that China wants to promote SCO, and India decided that SCO summit should happen online. That's one of the perspectives that has been shared by some experts, that this summit may have created some differences between India and China. So what I see is China has not retaliated against India in terms of the trade relationship as it has done in context of what was done against Australia and the US. But that could be a major option if the tensions that are there right now escalate in the future. Because China still feels that it can have India on its side. But maybe today, since Xi Jinping is skipping G20, that thinking might start changing, I believe. That having India on its side having India kind of neutral in the US and China is no longer possible, and India decided to take a side. So maybe that thinking is slowly changing in Beijing, and we'll see over next few months when Xi is supposed to go to APEC in the US, and if Xi Jinping decides to skip that summit as well, we will have a new kind of relationship and a global context where China is sitting out of these forums, and China is clearly sending a message that it's not worth my time, not worth my having this forum, because we have alternate forums which are far more representative of the ideas that China wants to promote. So it's giving up on a certain kind of development theory that China has promoted over the years. It's now fixated on a Xi Jinping driven diplomacy, like I like to call it, that kind of personality driven foreign policy is now shaping all these forums, and that's where we find ourselves today. So to quickly summarize, so unlike the past, the current phase of India-China relations is increasingly a sub-function of the US-China competition. That's what I think. It's like a sub-function within the broader US-China competition, and therefore until there is some easing of the US-China tensions, which is also likely to continue, the India-China relations will remain complicated. And this trade that India and China have may slow down a bit, because there's a slowdown in China that could attribute towards the slowdown that we saw over the last few months. So India will have to find alternative options within the region to work with, because China has this leverage of using trade to kind of project power over India in these forums. And India knows it very well that this leverage is something will be detrimental to India's interest over long run. It has to be addressed somehow.
Sure. Thank you very much. Professor Deepak?
Yeah, so thank you. As far as your first point, missed opportunity by China, I think it is a conscious and informed decision not to participate. So therefore, China has the calculation that it is not going to impact much. Anyhow, China sees G20 being dominated by anti-China forces. So therefore, it has taken this informed and conscious decision. So as far as India's opportunity, I think yes, because India has gone whole hog to propagate what it intends to, especially it is the governance model of Prime Minister Modi, which he is showcasing to the entire world. And for example, some of the areas where the focus is the inclusive growth, equitable health facilities, and the digital infrastructure, including climate resilience. So these, I think, four are the main issues, and how India has bridged the gaps of technological divide. And as Prime Minister has been proselytizing that India has already reached almost $1 trillion US transaction over the UPI, and how India's the digital divide had also been bridged by laying some 600,000 kilometers of optical fiber cables, and how 181,000 of the grassroots organization like panchayats, they have been connected with these optical fibers, and 100,000 of them, they are already wired. So this is the kind of governance model Modi is advocating and projecting, demonstrating, showcasing to the global south. And I think here Chinese policymakers, so they find it problematic, the very concept of Vasudev Kutumbakam, one world, one family, one future. China perhaps believes that India has hijacked one of the foreign policy pillars, that is building community of shared future, propagated by Xi Jinping. is, primarily speaking on the same lines, and also the kind of people-centric approach, or Prime Minister Modi calls it human-centric approach, has also been hijacked. I think that is one of the reasons why Chinese side, so they were reluctant to have unanimity on putting this Vasudev Kutumbakam in the document. And of course, the West-East problem and the chasm, which I talked about earlier, so it persists. Now, coming to the third point, the India-China economic engagement, I think there are a couple of problem areas I would like to flag out them first. So one is the problem of uneven bilateral trade, that has become more prominent of late. If we look at the figures from 2001 to 2020, India-China import and export, it increased by 25 times. And in 2022 alone, exports to India, they climbed to US $118.5 billion, a year increase of almost 22%. The second, I would say, the bilateral investment, it lags far behind the development of trade. The trade is burgeoning, even in the pandemic years. It touched high, and last year, of course, $136 billion US. And if the figures for this year, the first 8 months of this year is to be believed, so it is again, of course, the figures are revealed by the Chinese side, 84-point-some billion US dollars. And Chinese investment, of course, is there, but then accumulated investment, I don't think it is very, very much. A total, perhaps, a little more than $6 billion US, and 4 billion of which have been in a startup. Most of the Indian startups, they have been running with the Chinese investment. In fact, 18 of the 30 unicorns are now Chinese funded. And then this year onward, not exactly this year. This year, of course, many applications have been turned down. So one data shows that this year, since 2020, around 58 Chinese FDI applications that have been turned down. And the rejection, it is touching all-time high, last year, that's 2022. Now, the third is the structure of the trade is also very different, owing to the structure of their economies. And this also determined how the Chinese manufacturing took a flight, and how India's manufacturing has lagged behind. And of course, India is trying to catch up in this direction with Make in India, various other programs initiated by the government. But I think it is the structure of the economies, and so that has determined the trade and India's over-reliance on Chinese import, primarily medium and low-end products. Now, the final point, if you may allow, is the kind of mutual grievances, some of which Adil also flagged out. Of course, from Indian side, it is the market access being denied in some of the enterprises or sectors where India is strong. Manufacturing is one. This pharmaceutical is one, and IT sector is another. And then, of course, unfair practices in trade adopted by the Chinese companies in India, by making the shell companies, so on and so forth, and having a lot of problems. No wonder, many Chinese companies could have been raided off late by the Indian government. As I was pointing out, to this article written by Lan Jianxue of the CIS, China government-funded, Ministry of Foreign Affairs funded institution. So he says that India has resorted to digital suppression, of China by blocking hundreds of Chinese apps, deliberately delaying the approvals process from mobile phones, of Chinese brands, Xiaomi and Oppo has been named, and confiscating huge assets of Chinese companies such as Xiaomi. He says India has also restricted Chinese investment and purchase of Chinese equipment such as solar cell equipment, the import of Chinese-made power generation, transmission, and distribution equipment. And another thing he says that India has also slapped rules of origin, to obstruct Chinese goods and services in India. And apart from that, of course, he also said this is a public opinion war for desinitization, which it does sync with their approaches and policies, how they are maybe vilifying United States in the same way that they want to desinitize China from this economic and technological sectors. And as I said, that another one is India, joining hands with the United States and wanting to push China out of the global south, and also, the kind of restructuring of supply chain, also called, this fence shoring of the United States, wanting to develop supply chain with like-minded people. But he also says that, to force China out of, such maybe sectors or practices, and want China to make concessions on border issue perhaps, and restore the status quo, and as defined by India. He said that it will inevitably, have an unaccessible backlash. So he used the word on India itself and its interest with China. But at the same time, he says that so China is going through a process of rediscovering India. And here on this point, perhaps I will differ slightly with Adil. He said that so this will the understanding perhaps will continue, can have little understanding, but I think China has already made understanding about India that it is in hands and glove with United States to contain China, and in future perhaps most of the policies oriented towards India, so they would be determined by this approach. Jagannathan, over to you.
Thank you very much. We'll come to some of these points, but quickly a reaction from Sriparna.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. So I'll be very short and crisp in answering your three questions. The first is that is Xi Jinping missing the G20 summit? Is it a missed opportunity for China? In order to answer this, I'll take yours and the audience's attention to another country's leader who is not attending the G20, and that is Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He's not been attending for the last 4 years, and he says that these organizations or these groupings, they reek of inequality and unfairness. So China is going to definitely play this up much more and say that yes, G20 has been and a forum of inequality and unfairness, and China often portrays itself as the savior. So it's probably going to lap this narrative up, and it's going to push it even more. And there are a lot of countries in the world, Mexico just being one example, which will definitely throw its weight behind China. So this is not really a missed opportunity, because these groupings are not just, while they are supposedly economic groupings, they also carry with them, a lot of soft power and a lot of other nuances, which we often miss out. So this is the first thing. It's not a completely missed opportunity. China is going to bilaterally step up its initiatives with other countries in, India's neighborhood, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and all of this has been happening in the last few months. Or it's going to increase its weight in the BRICS or in the SCO, where it has a certain advantage in showcasing its leadership over India. The first answer is that. Second, is it a forward movement for India? The way India has taken over the presidency, etc. And even though Xi Jinping and Putin are not coming, is it really a forward movement for India? I think Professor Deepak mentioned about the theme of the G20, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and how it means one world, one family, and one future. Clearly, this is aimed at getting in the concerns of the global south on board. because the sub themes are those around climate change, sustainability, rising food prices, fuel prices, debt restructuring, gender-led development, and so on. These themes really affect the global south. India has also done something at the G20 which has never been done before, which is it spoke to 125 other countries, most of which are not even there in the G20, and these are countries of the global south, and tried to get a sense of what are these concerns which affect them the most, so that true peace, as opposed to China's multilateralism or real multilateralism, as it says, that can really be pushed forward. I'll give you another example. India has been pushing forward for the usage of millets. Why millets? Millets because they take less water. There is a climate change crisis which is happening. So if less water, and if we could shift to millets, it might seem like a very small step, but it helps scores millions and billions of people across the globe. So India has taken up very pertinent issues, which is why this has been a movement forward. It is irrespective of whether Xi Jinping or Putin or whether Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, they come or they don't come. This is going to be a big laurel for India's leadership capabilities. The third question was, would multilateral forums from now on, in which India and China are there, would they become more complicated from now on? Now that Xi Jinping has made it very clear through his behavior that accepting India as a leader and being in a room wherein India showcases its leadership, while China is just another country, is not acceptable to it. So I think even before this decision by G20, decision by Xi Jinping to not come for the G20, there were signs or fissures which were emerging, because China has called for a BRICS common currency. Dr. Jaishankar, India's external affairs minister, has made it very clear that we do not want such a common currency, because even though the reasons haven't been spelled out, they do not align well with India's worldviews. China's worldviews are very revisionist, India's are status quoist, does not sit well with India's worldviews. I think SCO, let's look at what has really been achieved at the SCO. More often than not, when the the SCO declarations they do come up, these are voices of just China and Russia, which call about which talk about exploitation from the West, etc. So India generally stays away again. So there is a huge divide even there. This whole thing about G20 just showcase that, well, even within regional groupings where India and China are there are huge divergences. Another example would be, the RCEP. Because of China's high-handedness, India has stayed away from the RCEP. A lot of other countries do want India to join in, but clearly, as mentioned by Adil, as mentioned by Professor Deepak, there have been huge instances wherein China keeps India under the thumb through its trade. So it's a huge concern. Clearly, multilateral forums will face more and more difficulties because of China's aggression in every sphere, in the economic sphere to be particular, against India. I wanted to make one last point about how India is actually looking to move away its reliance on China for its economic products. I think Professor Deepak briefly mentioned about the non-tariff barriers. There are huge sanitary and phytosanitary measures against Indian products in China. While we often talk about the lack of competitive advantages which Indian industry have, what we often miss out is that we do have comparative advantages in a lot of other segments. I think Professor Deepak did mention pharmaceuticals. We also have IT and so on, software, etc. And China is the third largest market in the world for software and IT. Yet, for Indian products where we have a comparative advantages, there are huge barriers. And these are all very political barriers. Even for agrarian products, which India does export. Even for agrarian products, which India does export. For example, basmati rice. There are huge non-tariff barriers. And, there's this list of 10 pests which China talks about. These should not be there in the basmati rice. Funnily, 7 of these pests are not there in India. They're there in China. And China would rather import this basmati rice from Pakistan rather than from India. So the whole relationship is very, it's very politicized. So what has India really done? And I'll move to how this is an opportunity for India. Xi Jinping not coming or, showcasing G20 as something which it actually not is. India has managed to reduce import dependency on China in 102 items recognized by the Ministry of Commerce last year. as items where domestic capacity can be increased to reduce import dependency. India is hastening the process to build resilience. I'll not go into details because Adil has already mentioned that. And we are trying to build a lot of other linkages. Generic drugs is one critical segment where India has a huge reliance on China. But even in last year's and last year's budget, there has been a huge allocation so that India can build its own APIs or active pharmaceutical ingredients. This actually works well for India because we can actually try and build alternative supply routes. And while multilateral forums in which India and China are there might seem to have fissures because of China's increasing aggression, it gives India an opportunity to build other multilateral linkages. So I'll rest my case with that.
No, thank you very much. In fact, I was just coming to those, trade-related specific issues. Now, as you have mentioned some of these issues, including basmati rice and all, my two-pointed question in the context of the seminar is that how do you see the China-India trade and economic contacts from here on moving forward? Particularly at a time there has been, a lot of tensions between the two countries, particularly at a time when India has decided to ban so many Chinese applications, putting a lot of curbs and sanctions, or let's say administrative severance on the Chinese companies coming to India. How do you really see the economic ties and the trade contacts moving here from now on? And what about the trade imbalance? You did pointed out some of these issues, but would you really address some of these issues? That how do you anticipate from here on the trade imbalance being addressed or or staying intact as it is, or maybe growing further between China and India? How do you really see the trade and economic context evolving from here on, particularly keeping in mind that China has been dominating the global supply chain all this while? It's not that China would not be dominating, even though today we are talking about new supply chain. The Chinese trades, contacts with the regional economies, with the global economy is really very high level. The second is that at a time when we are also talking about the US-China trade war. Third, at a time we are talking about China plus strategy in the Indo-Pacific. Fourth, at a time also Chinese GDP and there is a severe domestic economic slowdown, and the Chinese policy which seems to be shifted more towards the domestic consumption. So how do you really see and anticipate the China-India trade and economic contacts evolving from now on, or not evolving further, going into a deeper crisis? Which part of the story you would like to portray, and how you would like to see the trade imbalance getting addressed from here on, or still it will be a kind of the same kind of complaint coming from India, not really addressing those trade imbalance? How do you see? Maybe I'll start with again Sriparna, and then Adil, then Professor Deepa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Panda. How are India-China trade relations going to evolve from here on? Before I start my answer, I would like to use this one sentence. If there is a pattern, there is a reason. Now, if we look at the historical pattern of how India-China trade relations have been, we've seen and we've understood that there are a lot of barriers to equal access for Indian products in the Chinese market. And India has raised this over and over and over again with the Chinese side, and it has never been addressed. Which is why it means that if there has to be a reason, there's clearly a pattern to this. Now, you mentioned that India banned a lot of Chinese apps, starting with TikTok and then 256 other apps. Initially, when India did ban these, Global Times, which is state sponsored, of course, so it's clearly giving out the state voice. It actually, tried to poke some jokes at India, saying that India is not that huge a market, doesn't really matter to China at all. But when India did and banned these apps, then they threatened that we will take you to the WTO and etc. So, why is there this discrepancy? If India is really not that important, why the threats to take India to the WTO? India clearly was protecting its own national interest, because most of these apps are malicious. On the day that the PLA martyred 20 Indian Army soldiers at the borders, on the same day, there were 45,000 hacking attempts on the Indian cyberspace, most of which, 98% of which got tracked back to China. So clearly the battle lines have moved beyond the conventional battleground. So it's also the cyberspace. So India had to protect itself. There have been numerous anecdotes about how Chinese phones and Chinese apps and Chinese chips have been collecting very sensitive data from India's very sensitive regions. Earlier this year, it was also mentioned as to how there is this AI tool which China uses. It's called Speech Ocean, collects voice samples from the bordering areas of India. So these apps, these tools do not work well for our national security. They had to be banned. There was no economic rationale per se, as China would want to portray to the world. One good thing, despite the fact that India relies on China for a lot of its products, is that China has not been yet able to weaponize trade in the ways that it has been able to do to countries even of the global north, like Australia, for example. When Australia did talk about a probe into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, China punished it by blocking all its beef and wine exports to China, and which was very difficult. It did cause a huge economic distress to the Australian economy. They've done it in the past to Japan. They've done it in the past to South Korea. Despite the fact that we have reliance on the Chinese market, Chinese products, Chinese goods, that level of reliance, as we see in countries of the global north, that is not there. And I'm talking in relative terms, which is why this weaponization of trade hasn't happened so far. It does not mean that it's not going to happen. Therefore, in order to protect itself, India started talking about the rules of origin, I think, which Professor B.R. Deepak also mentioned while answering the last set of questions. And India is taking all sorts of steps to ensure that our national interests get served, because clearly China is not willing to change this pattern of India having a trade deficit. And clearly there's a reason. So from 2020 onwards, I think the reason is being understood more clearly by the current government. And from here on, India will try to protect its national interests. So hopefully they will evolve for the betterment of India. How they will work for India-China economic relations works well for India, maybe will not work well for China. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I come to Professor Deepak and Adil, please read through the Q&A box. There are some interesting comments and questions have come. So you might stay prepared. I'll come back to those questions. And also those in the audience, please put your questions to the chat box so that the speakers can address some of your questions. We'll have 30 minutes for this discussion. So quickly, I'll come to Professor Deepak and Adil for a quick comments on my earlier questions, and then we'll go for the discussion. Over to you. Professor Deepak, over to you. You are muted.
Sorry, I think as far as how India-China trade will evolve from here, I think, for a medium term, I think it is going to be pretty same. I don't think there is going to be much difference, and China would continue to have this huge trade surplus, and India will remain a very attractive market for Chinese consumer products. And whether the restructuring inside China, which is going on, replacing investment through consumption, I don't think that will have much impact on its trade with India. And also the plummeting economic indicators inside China, I don't think that will have a huge impact on India-China trade, because after all, the kind of consumer goods, so they are exporting to India, they are very much likened by the Indian consumers and the traders. They would love to go to China and get back with huge quantity of containers months after months. But as Sriparna pointed out, this security concern, so it will continue to stay there. And investment, as I tried to answer it in the previous question also, though the Chinese, they are beelining for foreign direct investment in China, but India has been very, very careful and cautious about clearing them. In the last year alone, 33 applications were turned down. But of course, I think in some area, perhaps in green energy and also perhaps in EVMs, India would be forward-looking if everything is outsourced from India itself. And I think BYD is going to be one example where India would be allowing the Chinese EVM maker to invest in India. And same is the case with other home appliances manufacturing, say, for example, Haier or Media or various other Chinese home appliance manufacturers in Chennai, in Pune. And I think to some extent it's also the case with solar energy also, because it has become one of the very important component of India projecting, its energy mix to the global south and also to the global north. Almost, I think, 35% of our India's energy mix is now renewable energy, so which is quite impressive. And India, wishes to achieve carbon neutrality by 2070, perhaps even early if everything goes in with plans. I think investment, India is also not looking for Chinese investment because the kind of replacement India has been able to find it and then you can say strengthen straight ties with like-minded people. Say Japan. I know you are sitting in Tokyo. You must be knowing Japan has committed that in the next 5 years it's going to invest $42 billion in India, and $4 to $5 billion has already been invested in India's northeast. So it's a massive investment. Comparing what Chinese President Xi Jinping committed during his India visit 2014, that China would be investing $20 billion. So you see where is this $20 billion? Accumulated investment only $6.2 billion, maximum I think reached $9 billion. So investment, I don't think India is looking at Chinese investment, but medium term, yes, so we are not being able to, but as far as the restructuring of the supply chains are concerned, until India is able to make some of its own supply chain and perhaps in tandem with other countries. So our reliance, as Sriparna said, that on China, especially with API and others, so it will continue with that. But I think this is cooperation and also caution, so it is going to be hand in hand as far as future evolution of China-India trade relations is concerned.
Thank you very much. Interesting observations. Adil, over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Panda. I'll echo what Dr. Deepak just mentioned about China-India trade going on in the same manner in the medium term. But I also think it will start plateauing out at one point. The kind of goods that China makes, the demand for that, the supply chains are changing. So what we are likely to see is that we might be in the best time of India-China trade. And at some point, it will start tapering out, slowly reducing as India's dependence on ASEAN will grow. That's where the supply chains seem to be shifting towards, and as well as India building its own supply chains. So that relationship will strengthen as the trade with China kind of declines slowly, but it would not happen overnight. It's like a long process, and that has other ramifications about India-China relations, the political economy inside China, how that shapes. So these restructuring of the political economy inside China as well as supply chains will shape how India-China economic relations pan out. And China, as Sriparna just mentioned, does not really have that kind of leverage in terms of hitting back at India. It has not used it because it doesn't really have that. But it can, in a scenario where relations start getting worse, there is military conflict or a kind of skirmish that we saw in Galwan. It has that opportunity. It can use it, but it could be through other means as well, cyber other opportunities exist nowadays. So trade may not be the best tool that Chinese statecraft has to hit back against India at the moment, and which is a good thing. And that is what I think New Delhi has realized, that it's a good time to reduce or de-risk, like Europeans like to call it, de-risk the economy. And that's the same trend I'm kind of seeing in India. We don't like to use that term in India, but that seems to be the trend right now. De-risk Indian economy from China as much as possible, because these vulnerabilities will give opportunity to China to retaliate in the future. So my point is that at some point in the future, maybe 5 to 10 years, or after that, the trade will start, declining over the period, and then this might be the best kind of period of India-China trade and economic ties. And India is going to capitalize on this opportunity. We've seen that with the kind of FDI policies that have been drafted by New Delhi. They always keep China in mind. China is always back of the mind. They know that this kind of supply chain restructuring is a moment for India, as other countries are also trying to do that, in ASEAN and in Mexico as well. So it's a moment that India is reacting to. But how does China see it? As Professor Deepak was earlier talking about, one view by the Chinese expert, I think they will not likely take it in a very kind of friendly manner. It's going to be more like, we need to do something about India's catching up with China through political or diplomatic reaction. So that's where these fissures will emerge, and China is likely to retaliate somehow to India's kind of ambitions.
No, thank you. Those are interesting remarks. In fact, I do take your point on the FDI policy, because if I could, connect the dots and correlate the things in India, I mean, the current FDI policy is quite centralized in many ways. There was a time when Manmohan Singh's regime was there. And if you see it in the China-India context, he actually, I mean, during Manmohan Singh and Hu Jintao's second period, there was a talk between sister city concept between India and China. And that sister city concept actually helped in many ways for the Chinese companies to talk and, directly come to the state government and, engage with a discussion and invest in different parts of India. As a result, we saw that there was a flurry of Chinese companies in southern part of India, particularly in Bangalore, in Mumbai, in Calcutta, in some of these parts of the part of India. But there has been a setback, huge setback to those things under Xi Jinping and under the current government in India, that is under Prime Minister Modi. So definitely things are not very encouraging. But I do take your point on most of the issues that all of you pointed out. Probably you would like to comment some of these issues during the discussions on the sister city concept, to the FDI thing, how in India, FDI, even though India has opened up in many ways, but India is also closed to China, close to certain countries, including to negotiate with the multilateral forums. We saw India withdrawing from RCEP. So FDI, India's FTA linkages, FTA agreements, and how do you really see in all of this context India's China relationship, particularly the economic contacts, evolving from now on? But before I invite each one of you to comment, let's take a few questions from the audiences so that you could address some of these questions together with my comments and my questions. First, I'll go for the comments. The question which has come from Kawamura-san. Kawamura-san, are you there? Maybe you could switch on your video and ask the questions directly to the speakers. Kawamura-san?
Yes? Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
How will India strike a balance between national security and trade with China? Some Indian politicians, both in the ruling BJP and also opposition parties, consider joining some Western-led initiatives to manage supply chains. And quite interestingly, India joins the Quad and the I2U2, which is an alliance with Israel and so Israel, India, UAE, and the United States on both sides of Eurasia. Thank you.
Yeah, That's an interesting thing. In fact, this is a classical dilemma for many international observers, how India is striking this balance between national security and trade. So I would, but before we jump into other comments and questions in the Q&A box, maybe I'll invite each one of your comments, maybe on my comments and my questions 1 minute, and then in Kawamura-san's questions in 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes each. Over to you, Professor Deepak, first.
You're muted, Professor Deepak.
I think as far as striking a balance between security and trade, so India has been trying its best. Remember Prime Minister Modi in a 2018 Shangri-La speech on Quad, and even Indo-Pacific didn't really want to antagonize China. And even now, I think to the displeasure of United States, India doesn't want or is very reluctant to declare China, this Quad as a security alliance targeted against any company, any country. But it is China who has demonstrated, and in fact, Chinese scholars, so they have written, very clearly about it, that India has been trumpeting the position of the United States and West in platforms such as SCO, BRICS, East Asia Summit, including G20, and trying to prevent multilateral mechanism from becoming a booster for the rise of China as a great power. I mean, this is the dilemma. This is from the Chinese side, and I think, of course, India doesn't want to enter in a military alliance, and it has, tried. It has always, tried to not make these grouping as sort of like mini Asian NATO, as China pronounces them. I think we still would like to do that, but at the same time, India would be susceptible to Chinese security threat, and these has been already made clear at various forums by our Prime Minister also, including recently concluded East Asia Summit. Prime Minister Modi has clearly said that everyone need to adhere to this rule-based world order. So therefore, I mean, this is a sort of like cat and mouse game. It will continue to go, and the shaping and reshaping, balancing, of these approaches will continue. Over to you, Jagannath.
Yeah, Adil, quickly.
On the question of national security and trade, I think, as I had spoken about earlier, India carefully examines what its vulnerabilities are vis-a-vis China. And we've seen that in case of RCEP, where India carefully kind of drew that line. It's trying to balance, its opportunities to grow India's status in the global affairs, as well as making sure we don't become overtly dependent on China. And something similar has happened when we talk about trade with Taiwan, India-Taiwan. There were some questions about let's not become overtly dependent on China in the process of growing trade with Taiwan. And it remains a question that currently India-Taiwan trade agreement is being discussed, that by the effect of having this trade with Taiwan, you might grow your dependence on China. So that remains a broader theme that we will continue to see. So national security kind of thinking in terms of economic policy is not going away anytime soon. That's my opinion. It will remain like the bottom line, and the period of like Manmohan Singh era of having sister city kind of alliance, that is not likely to come back, and it's going to be this way for a while, largely because of the geography with China. We share this border. The border dispute will continue to bear down, and there's no getting away from it.
Yeah. Sriparna?
Thank you, Dr. Panda. So I think most of the points have already been mentioned by Professor Deepak and by Adil. Striking this balance between national security and trade is really not easy, especially given our geography and especially given our, trade reliance so far. But the fact is that, since 2020 onwards, things have changed drastically for us. And we are paying attention to national security, which is why we started banning all of these apps one after the other. And a lot of apps are still currently being reviewed. There have been a lot of raids on Chinese companies, tax evasion, and so on. Without ensuring the security of a state, we cannot think of anything beyond that. So I think this has been a lesson which India has learned. Again, I'll just give the same example which Adil gave of the RCEP. And one reason why India stays away from the RCEP is clearly because of China. India does cite that there's a huge trade imbalance with China, which will only increase if we do sign on to the RCEP. But it's not that India does not understand that trade imbalance is something which stays for a certain period of time before it starts, balancing out. For example, we have a lot of bilateral FTAs. We have comprehensive partnership agreement with South Korea, and we have another one even with Malaysia. And the trade is skewed in these two countries' favor. It's skewed in the favor of South Korea, it's skewed in the favor of Malaysia. But neither of these two countries pose a security threat yet to India. So, which is why we are okay with trading or negotiating. Quickly answering the question about would India be joining some Western-led supply chains? If you just look at the latest visit to the US by Prime Minister Modi, which happened, there were a lot of agreements which were signed. And one of the agreements is about this very critical element called rare earth metals, wherein it has been decided that there'll be a supply chain which will be created of countries across the globe, like-minded countries across the globe, which have rare earth metals, and a collaborative effort in understanding how do we mine them, how do we share them amongst each other. Those sorts of things happen. China sits on 97% of the production of rare earth metals, and it has often used it against other countries, Japan being the most frequent example. So India does sign on to these agreements, and it will continue doing so, keeping in line with its own national interest needs. China has proved through its aggression, not just at the borders, but also in the economic realm, that at best it wants India as a subservient partner. And being a subservient partner is not something which is acceptable to India. So to safeguard its own national interests, India will look for other like-minded partners. Over to you, Dr. Panda.
Sure. Thank you very much. In order to save some time, because we have only 15 minutes, we'll be finishing in 15 to 17 minutes. So maybe I would request Sam to read out some of these questions quickly, and then maybe each one of you could take some of these questions in group and answer in free. So Sam, maybe you would like to read some of this?
Thanks, Jagannath. Yeah. Let me...
Maybe I would also request each one of you to read the questions online so that you could understand it quickly and better. Yeah, Sam, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jagannath. So first question we have from Georgie Mamashvili. He says, India is part of BRICS along with China and others, but also has deep cooperation with the West. How would you describe how India can take this path? Should India take the side, as Jaishankar said, India does not need to take the side? Second question, or I guess two questions from another audience member, Saptasa, says, compared to the recent past, China's diplomacy seems to have relatively lost its aggression. What are the possible reasons behind China's shrugging off of its so-called wolf warrior diplomacy? And then the second question is, of course, as Sriparna and others mentioned, the world is not alien to China's debt trap policy. While some Southeast Asian states have had trade and economic ties with China, they're also significant to India's Indo-Pacific policy. So how can India engage with Southeast Asia to weed away China? And then the last one is from Siddharth Togarty, who asks, from being the biggest importer of semiconductors from China, can India become a semiconductor hub? And how will that affect the economic relationship it has with China? So perhaps we can start with you, Adil, and any question you want to tackle first.
On the point of wolf warrior diplomacy, I think China realized that it's not paying the same kind of dividends. They were picking too many fights. So it doesn't serve a certain purpose at this moment. But that doesn't mean China has abandoned that line of thinking. There seems to be some kind of internal tension around what's going on with the foreign policy. And with the disappearance of the former foreign minister, those questions are just, getting more air. So I think this whole trend of wolf warrior diplomacy will continue in one form or the other. Certain voices were getting too powerful, so I think the top leadership decided to calm them down a bit to rein in these voices. In terms of India and China being on the BRICS, I think India is again trying to balance China. It's not a good idea to leave BRICS as such, because that will just give China an opportunity to run a grouping on its own. India has done something interesting by agreeing to expansion of BRICS, but allowing a certain kind of countries into BRICS, which allows India's interest to be projected than just China taking the lead on these issues. So that was a good diplomacy, in my opinion, and something similar has to continue wherever China and India find themselves at the odd. And on the point of Quad, I2U2, I think it was discussed already. So India is likely to continue to be part of all of these groupings and look at issue-based diplomacy, look at the issue and then address it according to where they find their interest to be, to be the best. And taking sides has never been the feature of Indian foreign policy, and I don't think that will be the case until unless there is a scenario where things look more black and white.
Thank you, Adil. Great points. Professor Deepak? You're muted again, Professor Deepak.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Sam. Most of the question, I think, have been answered. I'll go by what Adi has said. India will be in these groupings and in a place role according to its national interest is, as our foreign minister says, that is multi-alignment. As far as semiconductor, I think this perhaps was not touched by Adil. India would be very interested to make a sound supply chain as far as semiconductor is concerned. We have witnessed, especially between this 2020 and 2022, the shortage of semiconductor and the sales of cars in India. So they were jeopardized, and you have to wait for almost 5 to 6 months, and in some cases even longer. But in China, US, this high-tech war, so it has perhaps opened a window of opportunity for India as far as forging alliances or creating supply chains in semiconductors concerned. And we have been looking into investment, and there are preferential policies being rolled out by government to attract foreign investment. And in fact, Taiwan's Foxconn, it is already producing these iPhones in India from Chennai, and there are talks to open up other facilities in India along with other countries. So India would be looking forward to create a sound supply chains as far as reliance on these semiconductor on China is concerned. But of course, we know that so China only produces, say 24 nanometer or maybe 14 nanometer. And a couple of days back, if the reports are to be believed, that new phone which Huawei has rolled out, it has 7 nanometer chip, but people are doubting it that it is efficient as what would be rolled out by other countries. So we have to wait and watch, and of course it's not going to be easy to establish these new supply chains. So India also need to have strategic patience.
Thank you, Professor Deepak.
Over to you,
Sriparna?
Yes, I'll just quickly add just a few quick points. To the first question on BRICS, I'll divide that question into 2 parts. What about BRICS? Because India shares this space with China inside the BRICS. I think Adil mentioned this, that we are not going to leave, India is not going to leave the BRICS. Why? because it's not in India's strategic culture to leave any organization. If you look at the SAARC, which is completely a failed organization by every yardstick, because of the intense rivalry between India and Pakistan, Pakistan and Afghanistan, and so on, India has not left SAARC. So it's not in India's strategic culture. But does that mean India will align its interests with China? That again is not happening, because I think I mentioned this in one of the answers previously. We are not signing on to the BRICS common currency, which is being floated by China. It's always, as per India's strategic culture, it's always better to be inside a room rather than to be outside and to be straining one's ears to listen to what's happening inside. So if we stay inside, we can at least shape changes which can be better, as per India's worldview of one world, one family, and one future. That's the first one. Second, whose side will India take? Sadly enough, there are no permanent friends or foes in international relations. There are only permanent national interests. Talking about sides, historically, no country has taken India's side. We all agree, most of us, most like-minded partners, agree and accept that China is an aggressor. But every single time that there's been a conflict and lots have lost their lives and incursions have taken place and territories have been captured, no one talks about the Indian side. In 2020, when Galwan did happen, there were two countries which did condemn China in various degrees. One was the US, and Japan was also very critical and said that it cannot change the status quo by unilateral aggression. But beyond that, nothing really happened. Not that India expects, but reciprocity needs to be the hallmark if we talk about equal partnership. That sadly hasn't been happening. So as per Indian national interests, India will just follow its own national interests, and taking sides has never been India's forte. I think I'll skip the one on wolf warrior diplomacy because Adil beautifully elaborated upon that. How can India engage with Malaysia, Cambodia, and Singapore to wean China away from the Indian Ocean region? Trade. Today's mantra is the trade, and India has started its Act East policy. It is engaging with a lot of ASEAN countries, but the two out of these three countries which you have mentioned, Malaysia and Cambodia, they are extremely pro-China, if I could use that term, in all senses of that term. So it's going to be a little difficult to wean China away per se. But then we do have a CEPA with the Malaysia. We are trading as per the Act East. And any country understands that it is pertinent that it invests its energy where there will be certain returns. So India would invest rather, if you just talk about these three countries, I think it would be more beneficial, and India understands that, to invest its energies in Singapore. How to wean China away from the Indian Ocean region? I think by strengthening itself, because one example which fits here is the case of Sri Lanka. Last year, this year, Chinese spy ships have been coming in Yuan Wang 4, Yuan Wang 5, and the purpose clearly was, even though China claims it's a research ship, it was given permission by Sri Lanka to dock at the Hambantota port. Not that Sri Lanka enjoys it. It also wants to control its own strategic autonomy. But given the fact that China has deep pockets and Sri Lanka is indebted to China, Sri Lanka could not hold ground. What did India do? Well, Indian Ocean region is of strategic interest. So India set up a lot of jammers in the area so that information collection, data gathering cannot happen by these spy ships. So I would say self-reliance, or as in theoretical terms, we call it internal balancing. I think that would be the best way forward for India, and cooperating with countries where we can find certain commonalities. I think the rest of the questions have been answered by my co-panelists, so I'll just stop here.
Thanks, Sriparna. Jagannath, I think we only have 5 minutes. Do you have any lingering questions or final comments?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think those were excellent and very pointed remarks by all three of you. A very final thoughts from my side, if you could answer. I mean, there is economic slowdown everywhere, including in China and India. In India, there are many, many sectors where India is struggling, even though there is an optimism that Indian economy is doing better than the Chinese economy. How do you really see this economic slowdown in both the countries are going to affect the relationship in times to come? Very briefly, maybe, I know we need another seminar to discuss all of these things, but maybe just in 1 minute each. I'll start with you, Professor Deepak, first. in 1 minute shortly, and then we'll take 3 minutes, and then we'll stop the seminar. You're muted.
The global slowdown is indeed a challenge. It's affecting India also. It's affecting China worse because of the economic structure, a different export-oriented economy. So Chinese exports, so they are slumping. Less so on India because India primarily is consumption-oriented, service-oriented, economy. So so less of the impact. But I think in the long run, if India's economy remains resilient, it shows an upward growth trajectory, it is going to contribute so to the global economic growth. And China perhaps would be looking forward to explore more of the possibility of the Indian market.
Adil?
Just briefly, I think the slowdown that we are seeing in Asia and around the world is to do with the demographic change that's happening in China. But India has a kind of a demographic, is in a kind of Goldilocks moment where, certain age groups are coming of age and they are likely to transform the economy. And these demographic changes are happening around the world, which is why we are seeing this kind of economic change happen. As well as the industrial change, which is happening with the kind of new industries coming up, AI and those factors. But India is likely to benefit from these new opportunities that will emerge because of its young population, and which again is a challenge for China, how to handle that demographic change. A big population, which is not exactly productive in that sense, how to take care of them. But India is likely to gain a lot out of it. It's really up to the policymakers at this point how they want to deploy the policy instruments to use the demographic dividend that India has.
Sriparna?
Thank you. Very quickly, so because of the slowdown in China, consumption is at a historical low, and the statistics, the government statistics say it's at 21%, but independent analysts say it could be as high as 50%. So consumption is really low. It has slowed down. So if there's low consumption, there's going to be low consumption of goods from even outside. Whatever India sends to China, that's not going to be consumed further. So the trade deficit is going to increase. But there is a silver lining here as well. Given the fact that we have a huge trade deficit already, there are so many barriers to equal access for Indian products in the Chinese market. And India sends largely, or what China accepts from India largely, are agricultural products. India can very well find other alternative supply markets. As far as exports from China is concerned, I think a few days ago, there's already been a ban on, humongous imports of laptops from China. So we are trying to move away in any case. And we're trying to, I think Professor Deepak mentioned about how semiconductors industry is being attempted to be set up within India. So we can very well either produce electronics or get alternative supply routes for electronics. So while in the short term, there might be a jump in the trade deficit for India because China will not take more products from India, I think maybe in the medium term, this is going to stabilize, and there's a silver lining for India. So that's how I would see it.
Thank you very much. No, I do agree with you. In fact, on the semiconductor, even though this trade deficit is going to linger on, but as officially India has been talking about self-reliance India, I think there is a process which has started. There might be a political rhetoric, there might be a political pompism in order to promote certain ideas in India, but one would agree that certain initiatives in India in recent past which has been taken, it is actually in the greater benefits and interest of India in the longer run. And on the semiconductor particularly, it's not only with Taiwan we have been talking, but also with a range of other countries, including with South Korea. Which is a very promising country. South Korea is a promising economy in Asia, and there is a lot is happening between India and South Korea, particularly on the IT sector, including semiconductor. And these are actually very encouraging signs for India. And I do agree with all of you, particularly when Adil you mentioned about the demographic changes which is taking place in India. And that's actually a plus point with India. The young workforce coming and contributing to Indian economy is definitely going to put some challenge to China, Chinese economy in times to come, even though temporarily, I do agree with you, both Sriparna and Professor Deepak, that the trade deficit is going to linger on for some time. But I think with this note, let me thank all of you for your time, for your excellent remarks, and for a very engaging discussion on a timely topic. And I think we can't have a better day to discuss this when Delhi is hosting the G20 and the Chinese president is missing. So I'm sure there will be opportunity to engage with all of you, not only in this venue, but also in other venues. We are going to expand our China discussion, India discussion, both within ISDP and YCAPS events, but also in other events. We'll stay in touch. But with this note, let me thank all of you who have been attending this seminar. This seminar is being organized under the Europe-Asia series of YCAPS and ISDP cooperations framework. And Sam, my colleague, who has been tremendous in terms of coordinating with me in terms of putting up this seminar, will be staying in touch with all of you for future events. But with this note, let me thank all of you and see you next time, and keep a good health and have a good weekend ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Sriparna. Bye-bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye.